Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer. Today I'm sitting down with George Cheung from More Equitable Democracy. They're working to advance electoral system reforms that increase representation of underrepresented communities, in particular communities of color. You can check out their podcast, The Future of Our Former Democracy, and their recently released documentary, American Troubles, A Tale of Two Democracies, available on YouTube. I really encourage you to check it out. It's a great way to hear directly from those leading efforts in communities across the U.S. Thank you, George, for coming onto the Just Solutions podcast.
I'm so excited to be here.
On this podcast, we mostly talk about climate and environmental issues, but who's elected, how they're elected, and how they govern has a significant impact on the ability to address them. George, you and I have a deep interest in and commitment to racial justice. We spent our long careers trying different strategies, holding different positions, experiencing big swings in the political landscape. So I'm excited to learn more about the work you're doing now in democracy, why you think our electoral system needs to change so voters and votes matter, and your recommendations for change. So you and I have known each other for a long time, George, and during that time, you've done a lot of work on electoral justice issues. What draws you to this work?
Well, since we've known each other since kindergarten, you've seen it all before. So I think the first thing that I recall in terms of what set me on this path was geometry. Mr. Hall, Renton High School, class of 19-something, don't do the math. He said, almost every day, you can't play the game if you don't know the rules. He was obviously applying that to geometry, postulates, theorems, and all of that. But I really took that as a deeper meaning in terms of whenever you're engaged in some type of change process, you have to know the rules. And if you kind of just don't pay attention to it, you can get played by it. And so fast forward, I ended up coming out at the end of high school, beginning of college, and I wanted to pursue organizing and advocacy around social justice. And so my first job was as a civil rights investigator for state government, state of Rhode Island. And this was at a time where Clinton had won an election in 1992 and was in the process of filling out his cabinet. He nominates for the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. So this is the top civil rights law enforcement agent in the country. He nominates a brilliant scholar by the name of Lonnie Guinier. Lonnie Guinier had written a ton about electoral system. She had led the NAACP Legal Defense Fund around their voting rights work and had been the first tenured law professor at Harvard, I believe, and just did a lot of writing. And she wrote a lot about affirmative action, and that didn't go over well among certain senators. But she also wrote about electoral systems. She argued that the Voting Rights Act is completely necessary but insufficient and stuck in the 1960s. If you keep a winner-take-all electoral system, the best you can do is to draw the awkward majority-minority district. I'm like, okay, I get that part. She said, if we care about self-determination and liberation, we cannot have that be predicated on racial segregation. You can't have both at the same time. And therefore, you need to actually change the electoral system. Something more that's proportional, that provides a minority, however you slice and dice it, enough of a say in politics that they feel bought in to governing. And so that kind of shook me on so many levels. The biggest level was wait, we can change that? I just thought that, we're America. We kind of figured it out 250-ish years ago, and all is set in stone. And she kind of said, no, in fact, we owe it upon ourselves as the living to actually affirmatively kick all the tires, scrap all of them, and come up with systems that actually work for us. Not the America of 250 years ago, which was largely a slave-based society, but a country that at least some of us aspire to be a true multiracial democracy. We need a system that allows us to all have a say. So I feel like that agitation, I guess, opening my eyes, it was both unsettling, I thought I had a poli-sci degree, and all of a sudden I'm being schooled by this person who is opening my eyes to all these different ideas. And so that kind of set my trajectory on this work.
That's great. That's great. Now, it's been a long time since President Clinton was in the White House, although maybe to you and I, it feels like just yesterday. So why do you think working on election reform is so important now more than ever?
Yeah, there's two reasons that I think about. The first is around racial justice. We just had a Supreme Court decision Calais versus Louisiana, which essentially has eviscerated most of what had been left of the Voting Rights Act. The part that actually articulates that under certain conditions, jurisdictions must draw majority-minority districts in order to kind of vindicate the representational rights of minorities. And so without that, we're now back to almost like pre-civil rights era. We have an electoral system that is just purely majority rules in all of its forms. And really, is that a democracy or is that just like tyranny of the majority? So the voting rights piece of minority groups, whether they be people of color, be low-income folks, renters, however you slice and dice it, that part just doesn't fit with our current electoral system under the new jurisprudence. The other piece of it is it's about the two-party duopoly and polarization. So there was a French, I think, sociologist named Duverger. Duverger came up with Duverger's law, which basically says if you have a winner-take-all system where there's only one winner in these legislative races, you tend to gravitate towards two parties. And it makes sense because let's say if you're a Green party and there's an opening in one election, you do a lot of organizing and you kill it and you get 10% of the vote, which is like high watermark. Well, 10% gives you exactly squat. That's the technical term here. Squat in terms of political representation. And so if you keep playing this game over and over again, you go 10, 15, even 20%, you still get squat. And so at some point, their supporters, your staff, maybe even you are like, this isn't really working out. Maybe let's try to influence one of the other parties more towards the values that we hold dear. And so we just end up with only two options. And with that, in that situation, we just have deep polarization. It's like it's one or the other. It's good, bad. It's democracy versus authoritarianism. And there's no nuance. And so a lot of the issues that we care about, like climate change or racial justice, get polarized as well. Like one party is nominally in favor of it and does as little as possible to kind of claim that they are the party of those issues. And the other party is just kind of like reflexively hostile to it. And so what we see in other systems, other countries that have proportional representation, they don't have the same issues of underrepresentation of minority groups or of like polarization such that there's no compromise whatsoever.
So much of the attention has been on redrawing districts, and I think there's a concern about what's happening there. So how does that problematic in the work that you're thinking about just broadly around democracy and civic engagement?
We used to have maybe more social or political norms around the redistricting process, and we had jurisprudence that required certain level of minority representation. That's gone. And so it wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm aging myself, but there was a time when Tom DeLay from Texas did mid-decade redistricting, everyone like freaked out, like, can he do that? Technically speaking, legally, he could. And he kind of like drew 5 more Republican districts like out of thin air. And then everyone was like, he can't do that. But then no one could stop him. And so we kind of went back to business a while longer. I would say in the last like 2 to 4 years, we've entered this new phase of like the forever wars around redistricting. Not only is that like no longer like taboo to like reopen the redistricting process outside of the decennial regular process after the census and reapportionment, but now I think that every 2 years after the election, states both blue and red will run back to the state house and redraw maps based on the new data to solidify more of an advantage when you have power. So it's now at the point where it's now like a farce. Like everyone sees it, like the emperor has no clothes, how dysfunctional we are, and we're all frustrated by it. The insiders are just like, well, we have to play the game better than the other side. And yet there are very few folks within the kind of political world that are articulating like, how do we get out of this situation? It's more of like high stakes or like an nuclear arms race around redistricting without any end in sight.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I want to ask you is there's a lot of attention that starts to focus on voter registration campaigns. This idea, there's a lot of discussion about the MAGA base, where are they at? Where is their political leanings? Is there a way to move them? So I think for you and I, work on progressive issues, that is where we spend a lot of time. I mean, what do you think about that as a strategy?
If you kind of think about the legacy of Jim Crow and the efforts nowadays to restrict the vote in all the kind of clever, underhanded ways that you can in terms of requiring voter identification or the new effort to restrict vote by mail, efforts to just make it a lot harder. One of the things, not to jump ahead, but I've done a lot of looking at other democracies and how they address some of the issues that we're stuck in. And one of the countries that I think about a lot is Australia. Australia is a former British colony, settler colonialism, very interesting parallels. But one big difference they have is that they have compulsory voting, meaning everyone has to vote. You get fined if you don't vote. It's a very small fine and it's largely unenforced. Don't tell Australians that I said that because they take it very seriously. But when we went to go talk with Australians, they said over and over again, compulsory voting is core to our democracy because we understand that the role of the government is to remove all barriers to voting. Everyone has to vote. It's their obligation. They get fined if they don't. And then we let the chips fall where they may. And then we kind of go from there. We are so far from that goal in terms of everyone voting. We talk about it, but it seems like all the public policy is moving in the other direction in terms of how can we make it more difficult. It's all done in very underhanded ways. And, just the one last thing about when we talked to Aussies about this, they kept saying, we feel sorry for you. I'm like, ouch, that hurts. Say more. Well, we feel sorry for you because, you have to yell at people and say the most outrageous things to motivate them to vote. It's not conducive to a functioning democracy if everyone's just yelling at each other to say, the other side is evil and must be defeated. I remember talking to a news director when we were visiting the Capitol, and I said, okay, I'm going to test this hypothesis because I've heard this and I don't believe it. Okay, you have a spouse, right? He says, yes, I have a spouse. We've been together for a long time. You work in politics, right? Yes, I'm the news director of the national broadcaster. I said, okay, do you know how your spouse voted? He smiled and he says, I don't. We talk about politics, but we don't talk about that individual vote because it's very private. It's a very personal thing. It's not are you with me or against me? It's there are lots of choices and people are free to associate with whoever they want. And it's never to the point of you're going to vote for the party that's going to just take down our democracy. So in that way, I was kind of shamed for the first time as an American. It was ouch, that hurts.
And your argument would be that some of that is driven by this two-party system. And so part of the way we're structured, the history that we have, and again, I think a lot of people listening, kind of talked about third parties, but this winner takes all is sort of, how we see things. And it's interesting that we're going to talk about a different way that things can happen. So in particular around how it facilitates racial justice. So a lot of what you're talking about, right, is the restrictions that are being proposed and advanced right now really are to restrict a certain part of our U.S. population. And that is what is so troubling and so problematic. So let's just do some basic definitions for everyone.
Yes.
So first, the winner take all, I think, is understood, but it'd be great to talk about that. And then in particular, how it's different from what you're recommending, which is proportional representation.
Yeah. So we have to kind of go way back. The winner-take-all electoral system was first established by the English in the 1400s. So we all remember our history, well, some of us do, about the Magna Carta. We remember there's some document that a king and some dudes signed and something happened. It was like a thing. That was actually the genesis of the first round of English elections. Basically, King John gave up the kind of absolute monarchy and ceded some power to some elite class of landowners. They're all men. They all had property. Basically, those men with property said, we need representation because we need to tell you off about how we don't like you taking all of our money through taxes. And so we need a way to have some type of legislative body to inform you about how we feel, which is basically stop fighting other countries. We want to keep our money. And so they started having elections soon after that in the about mid-1400s, whereby, this kind of ruling elite, they were organized by counties, their estates essentially provided the kind of geographic basis for a district, shall we say. And then they had these elected officials. They were called Knights of the Shire, very Hobbiton-esque, I think. But basically, it was a plurality winner. Everyone voted for these elite people to represent other elite people, and the highest vote getters took office and would go to the king and basically say the same thing over and over again, let us keep our money. That system is still what the UK uses today, virtually unchanged from the 1400s. The franchise has expanded tremendously. It's not just like white dudes with property over a certain value. Basically, everyone who is a citizen, that's also, interesting questions in terms of who gets to be citizens, but all citizens over a certain age get to vote. And so the idea that you could have a very simple election, but apply it to a really diverse electorate, it just doesn't match. And so bring it to the present, all former British colonies also adopted the same system when they became democracies, because it was just kind of like the British or English tradition. We kind of like adopted English common law and a bicameral legislative body. Yes, we declared independence 250 years ago, but we basically kind of adopted all the same practices that the British had in effect when we declared independence. So in that way, that's why Canada, the US, all these other former British colonies start with the same winner-take-all electoral system. Most of them have said, we don't want this anymore because it's like antiquated. It doesn't really help us represent who we are. And so we need a different way. Some of them, Canada and the US in particular, have maintained that tradition. And so that's how we're kind of stuck with something that was established about 600 years ago.
It's a long time ago.
Can you believe it? I mean, ago. A computer from 600, the operating system just doesn't work. You can't turn it on anymore. So we're still using this technology from a very long time ago.
Amazing. And so from your perspective, what makes proportional representation better? Let's talk about that a little bit more.
So political scientists in general put all electoral systems in one of two buckets. There is winner-take-all systems, which largely established by the English-British. And then there's this other family called proportional representation. And there are variations on a theme, but the simplest idea is a political party will get a fair share of seats based on their vote share. Under a winner-take-all system, 20%, like the Green Party example, 20% gets you nothing. And so there's a big difference when you have a system where 20% actually gives you potentially a ticket to being in a governing coalition and being able to shape policy versus 20% here is like, you might as well have not even tried.
And can you walk us through the application? Like, how does that work out? So you get 20%, you have some proportion. Like, can you apply it to a national level for us? What would that mean at a congressional level?
Sure. Well, let's take the example of Ireland, for instance. Ireland adopted a proportional system at the time where they got independence from the UK. So they split in about 1920s. They fought a war. Interestingly, when Ireland was part of the UK, because it used to be the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, so they were all combined for a while because of, settler colonialism, they had winner-take-all elections. And at the time of at the end of World War I, the franchise for Catholics was expanded. And so it wasn't just like an elite. Basically, virtually all Catholics, they were still sexist. I think women had to be over the age of 30 because, I don't know, they thought that women weren't smart enough until they turned 30. I don't know. I'm not going to defend it. I'm just telling you what they did. But they had an election after World War I where basically all the Irish folks could participate in the UK elections. Well, because of winner-take-all elections and the single-member district system, they almost swept all the seats in Ireland. When I say they, I mean Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is, we might have heard it before because of, the troubles if you're old enough, but Sinn Féin was a revolutionary pro-Republican, as in we want to be a Republican, not have the king be the head of state. They were radical. They wanted to reject everything that was British. They swept that election on the island of Ireland, and then the Westminster freaks out. They're like, we're going to have all these revolutionaries come into Westminster and legislate? Like, how is that going to work? So as soon as they could, Westminster, the UK government, imposed proportional representation on the island of Ireland just so that they wouldn't win all of the seats. The Irish who won those seats, the Sinn Féin party, they basically said, look, we reject everything that is British. So we're not even going to take the seats that we deserve in Westminster. We're going to use that election result and form our own parliament and, use those elections for our own purposes. And by the way, we're going to keep proportional representation because we think it's actually more functional for a democracy, not this whole antiquated 1400s Magna Carta BS. We want something that's modern that actually helps us move into the future. Okay, so as it applies today, they have a system called single transferable vote. It's basically larger districts where they have about 5 members per district, and they use a ranked ballot. I won't go into the math. If you want to come out with more math, I'll explain it. But long story short, if your party wins 20% of the vote, you'll get 20% of seats in the Dáil, their national parliament. And they take it one step further. If you win 20% of seats, you get to pick 20% of committee chairs. So they take the idea of moving away from winner-take-all majority rules to the logical extreme, the logical conclusion of, if you win 20% of the seats, you should win 20% of political power. And then they have a process kind of like the NFL draft in terms of who gets to pick the next chair. And so, they're kind of like, well, I'm the Green Party. I really want the environmental chair. And so they jockey and make sure that they kind of get the best that's available when it's their turn. And so I think that's really telling in terms of when we went to learn about the Irish system, they kept saying, oh, by the way, we use a D'Hondt method to decide who gets to pick the committee chairs. And it probably was the 4th time that they kept saying that it dawned on me like, wait. It's not just like the majority, like the ruling coalition that gets to pick all the committee chairs. Are like, no, we keep telling you like everyone gets some share of the committee leadership. I'm like, my mind just blew apart. I just don't understand that. I'm so American that's hard to understand. But once you kind of accept a different system in your mind that we could do things differently, then there's a world of possibility.
Let's talk first about other countries that have this type of system. Where else does this?
So there are essentially 3 different variations on the theme. Ireland and Malta are the ones who have established what we call single transferable vote. That's one style under the proportional representation family, one of the members. And so there's a number of cities that also use it. It's really helpful for nonpartisan races because it doesn't require a vote for a political party. And so there are a number of places, including Portland, Oregon, which recently adopted as a viable kind of American opportunity. The other systems, I'll talk about a hybrid. There's a hybrid called mixed member proportional. It's what Germany uses. And the way that works is instead of just voting for one member of Congress, you get 2 votes. You vote for your favorite candidate in your district. So in that way, it's the same. Lots of single member districts, plurality winner, whoever gets the most vote wins. Your second vote is for political party. You pick, let's go back to the Green example. Let's say that the German legislative body has 100 seats. Let's say we also win 10% of the political party vote, that second vote. But yet, we only win 2 of the individual single-member district seats, where there's big university communities, because that's where we have the ability to win, maybe not the majority, but at least a plurality. And let's say that you're a party leader. We want to make sure that you look good and you want to run in that district where you can actually win straight up. But we only win 2 seats through the single-member districts, but we deserve 10% of all seats or 10 seats in the legislative body. Well, before the election, we as the Green Party have published a party list of all of our members that we would seat in order of importance. So your party leader, let's say I'm vice chair, so you'll be number 1, I'll be number 2. We care about folks of color. We care about immigrants and refugees. We care about trans people, LGBTQ people. We will create a list that reflects our values. Maybe folks on the right, they don't care that much about reflective democracy or at least reflection of the party. So maybe they don't care about that as much. But, you get to pick internally. And so basically, we remove the 2 people who have already been elected from the single-member districts and then simply take the next 8 people off the list. And there is our 10 people. It's very straightforward. The only kind of quirk around it is that they have a 5% threshold. So your party needs to get at least 5% of the party vote in order to get access to a proportional amount of seats. They did that because though they had proportional representation when they became a republic after they got rid of the Kaiser, after World War I. But because they had no threshold, they had like dozens of parties win seats, and they just weren't able to form a governing coalition, which meant that a strongman figure could come in and say, this is hopeless. Only I can fix it. Give me all the power, and I will take us into the future. That was a guy named Adolf Hitler, and, that didn't go so well. And so after World War II, they instituted the 5% threshold in order to not be so fractured. So that's a little bit of that story.
Yeah, interesting history lesson. So, George, in those places, about how many parties then generally are on the ballot?
On the ballot, many.
My question was going to be how many parties are in the system generally in those countries. But if you're also saying that there's a different number on the ballot, help me understand why there's a difference.
In a lot of these countries, there will be parties that rise out based on a single issue, like a legalized cannabis party. Those issues typically get absorbed by other parties that have a broader set of policy prescriptions. But overall, it doesn't prevent these parties from at least trying. And sometimes they break through. Like there are People Before Profits is a fairly significant party in Ireland, and they typically win 1 or 2 seats. So they keep going because they actually can have meaningful representation. In Germany, they typically only have about 4 or 5 parties that clear the 5% threshold. And so that's the kind of smaller universe of parties that negotiate amongst themselves to figure out who can get to 50 plus 1 to form a governing coalition. I will say in Germany, one of the other things that I learned a lot about is their culture of remembrance. They have a requirement that all high school students visit a concentration camp. They don't tolerate misinformation, like some people would deny that the Holocaust ever happened. Actually, that's illegal in Germany. So we can debate whether or not, freedom of speech should protect that. They don't tolerate it. And so with that deep culture of remembrance, they basically have this, what they call a firewall, such that it's taboo for any political party, even the center-right, from even negotiating with the far right to form a governing coalition. Like, don't even look over there. Like, it's not good for our democracy. They are actually understood as being anti-democracy. And so, very much so, it's the center-right and the center-left that usually govern in like a grand coalition. From the center, it's very it's conducive for long-term policymaking because they don't have the whiplash that we have of like one wins and then the other wins and wants to undo everything that last administration put into place.
And so you feel like that has a little bit of a stabilizing outcome that you're seeing in Germany. Is that the case in other places too?
I mean, we are at a very challenging time in terms of democracy globally because we have seen this rise of authoritarianism, of scapegoating, immigrant and refugee communities, of LGBTQ folks. So this is a very difficult time. And yet we do have, for the most part, a lot of democracies that use proportional representation be able to govern from the center, sometimes center-right. Some of them end up with very right-wing governments. But sometimes I think the experience in Austria is somewhat telling. The far right wins an election and they can't really govern. They're really good at yelling at people and saying things that motivate some people to vote in a way that they might not have voted before. But it's another thing to actually govern and to pass budgets and to meet the needs of communities that are much more complicated than like, let's just shut down the borders, no more immigrants. Like, okay, how is that actually addressing some of the deep issues that we care about? So it's not a panacea to all of the problems, but at least it provides an opportunity for more rational governance, more compromise, and more ability to set good policies as like a long-term strategy.
For sure. And I think just in general, voters are complicated. I think to bifurcate everyone into 2 very extreme positions, it allows for a lot of reflection of that complexity and people being in different places on a lot of different issues. Very interesting. So let's talk for a minute about the U.S. You talked about our history, connection to the kind of founding fathers and their connection to England at the time. There are places with proportional representation. We'll dig in a minute because you talked about Portland, Oregon. But that system in general, is it applied anywhere else? I mean, outside of the electoral system, is there generally this understanding? I feel like as Americans, we're very much like majority rules, but are there other examples outside of the electoral system in which you see a little bit more of this proportional approach? Just kind of curious.
Actually, interesting that you ask because a lot of corporate boards use what's called cumulative voting. You remember when, you're at a workshop and you're given like 5 colored dots. There's a bunch of different options on the butcher paper, and you can allocate your 5 dots however you want. 1 each to 5 options, or all 5 on 1 if you really feel strongly about that one option. This is a system that a very large number of corporations use to elect their governing board. And so within that context, they also understand that they need to have a board that's somewhat representative of their shareholders. And so having a winner-take-all system where one faction could dominate is just not helpful for them. Why they haven't advocated for that to be adopted in public policy, that's a more difficult question. But there certainly is a recognition that the simplest way of doing elections is not always the best. I will bring it back to the electoral system in terms of the experience in the U.S., because we might think that, blah, 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 George, this is all very European, like, tell me about me. Well, in fact, the U.S. has experimented with proportional representation in very significant ways in the past. We just don't remember it. It's like this collective amnesia for various reasons. So back in the early 1900s, this is kind of like the peak of the progressive reform era, which ushered in so many social policies that we still benefit from today. One of the things that towards the tail end of that progressive reform era that they thought deeply about was, how do we dismantle the non-ideological, corrupt big city machines like New York City? These are the Democratic Party, but largely they just want power for its own sake. They're not ideological. And so these reformers understood that the party could hold on to power because they drew the maps. They could draw maps that helped basically across the board where they could be assured of 55% of the vote share, thereby solidifying their almost 100% control of a city council, New York City, for example. And so what they did was they ushered in proportional representation, very similar to Ireland, in about 24 cities, including New York City in the 1930s. Shocking when people say, I think ranked choice voting was just implemented in New York City for the first time in these last few elections. No, they actually had it beginning in the 1930s into the 1940s. And so what happened was, the way that it worked, each borough, let's say Manhattan, gets a certain number of fixed seats based on voter turnout. Let's say Manhattan gets 5. Everyone in Manhattan gets to choose from the same list of candidates, and the top 5 win. With 5, you only need about 17-18% of the vote to win a seat. And so this is a tremendous help for a lot of different folks. The first women get elected. The first people of color get elected. Adam Clayton Powell is the first African-American who gets elected to New York City Council and then moves on to Congress pretty soon after. Minor parties, such as the American Labor Party, get elected. In the second election under proportional representation in New York City, by this time, Adam Clayton Powell gets elected to Congress, so he leaves. Another African-American gets elected. Someone by the name of Ben Davis. Ben Davis comes from a Republican family that has published a Black community newspaper. He's a lawyer. He gets radicalized because he's defending Black communists who are being attacked by the federal government because of early Red Scare era politics. So he becomes a communist. He ends up getting elected as the second African-American under the banner of the American Communist Party. Because once again, the Democrats are not ideological. So this is, if you want a real progressive kind of critique of capitalism at that time, it's a Communist Party. Well, World War II ends and we quickly go into the Red Scare era. And virtually every city, there were about 24, every one of those cities repeals proportional representation because the Democrats and the Republicans collude, and basically they say anything that allows for anything further to the left of us is seen as anti-American. They're commies. We need to get rid of this. It's just simply un-American. There is one city that adopted it back then that has kept it all the way through. It's the bellwether city of Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That's amazing. That is amazing history. And it's interesting how, the conversation is coming back, right? It seems that there's a resurgence of really looking at our electoral system. I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction, clearly. It feels very limiting. It is reflective of what you're saying in the 1930s. So what do you think it'll take for us to get back there?
It's like Back to the Future, right?
Right.
Dating myself. Oh, that's so tragic. Right. Things just need to get worse before they get better. And sometimes It's only at very dark moments that we're willing to even entertain the idea of systems change. Because largely speaking, if it ain't broke, why fix it? But we all now see that things are broken. And some of those taboos, like, ooh, communism, socialism, scary, like Soviet Union. Well, okay, the Soviet Union kind of collapsed. We can't really say that China's communist. They're maybe more capitalist than we are. And so, I think when Bernie Sanders runs for president and he's taken seriously, it's like, wait, he's a socialist. Like, we're now in a new era where young folks, they're growing up in an era where capitalism really isn't working for them and they don't see the same opportunities that maybe we saw or our parents saw when they were growing up in terms of ability to move up the kind of economic ladder. And so without that kind of stain of like, oh no, communism's bad, we can't even entertain any of that, things are at the point where these radical ideas are now being debated. Folks, even on the inside, I have conversations with folks who keep saying, like, we are post-democracy at this point, so now we don't have to just like accept these sacred cows as a given, right? I'm like, yeah, wow, I can't believe you of all people have said that. So I do feel like we're now at a point where there's a lot more deeper conversation, not just among the kind of nerds like me.
So where are there efforts to change to this proportional representation, or some places ranked choice voting? Where's that happening? What are the efforts?
There's a lot of efforts. So I direct an organization called More Equitable Democracy. We have 20 different partner organizations, and we're driving financial resources and technical assistance and a learning community to support their efforts to incubate these campaigns. But the biggest advance has been Portland, Oregon. I think that I had mentioned that earlier. And so we had been working with racial justice advocates in Oregon for quite some time around the redistricting process. And as we pivoted to post-redistricting, it was great to help folks understand the limits of the redistricting process, because try as you may to get like the fair map, it doesn't really exist. It's kind of like an illusion, because with a winner-take-all system, there's always trade-offs. You can't have everything. And so when those folks started to think about other jurisdictions where they were like shut out of power, where though they had a significant base, they really couldn't break through and advance policy that helped drive resources towards their communities. And so we supported them through the process of it's very sexy, it's a charter review process. Write that down, everyone. It's the most important low-key thing that you'll ever hear of, but if you can get involved, that's a really great way to catalyze change. So under the Portland City Charter, every 10 years they have to have like a review process, kick the tires. There had been efforts before to change the Portland city government, which was a commission style of government. 5 commissioners, all elected at large citywide by numbered positions. So you had to win 50 plus 1 citywide, which is like a congressional district. Like the types of candidates who can win are well-heeled, access to money, name recognition, blah, blah, blah. And it shuts out communities of color in particular, low-income communities, lots of communities that don't have those types of resources. And so as we were helping them decide like what they should advocate for, they said, okay, so let's just go to 5 single-member districts, maybe 7, maybe 9. But we showed them, because of, frankly, Oregon's deeply troubling anti-Black history, that there isn't the same type of urban segregation that you have in most American cities, and that you cannot draw a majority-minority district in the city of Portland. And so they're like, WTF, what do we do now? And we're like, well, let me tell you what we can do. So we introduced the idea of proportional representation, a la the Irish model, and they were like, that's it. This is the way that we can lower the threshold so that we can actually contest for power, get our advocates, our champions elected, and actually have meaningful voice in City Hall. So they ended up putting forth a proposal that was to expand from 5 to 12, but have 4 districts with 3 members each. And so with 3 members each in a quarter of the city, all you need is about 25% plus 1 to win a seat. And so they won that election in 2022. In 2024 was the first election under the new system, and it was a sea change in terms of at least descriptive representation. It went from fairly monochromatic, like pale, male, stale, largely, not exclusively, but it went about half men, half women. 5 out of the 12 are folks of color. 4 out of 12 are LGBTQ identified. 3 out of 12 were endorsed by the Democratic Socialists, and 3 out of 12 were endorsed by the Police Union and the Chamber of Commerce. 2 are renters. And so the ability for certain communities that have been completely shut out of power because of the rules of the game really have a seat at the table, really have access to City Hall, has been just really amazing to see.
Wow.
So there's a lot of other cities that are starting to think about this because, especially after the Calais decision where we can't rely on majority-minority districts to ensure that communities of color have representation, there has to be a different way.
But do you find that the people in charge, you have to be able to pass policy in the case of Portland. How do they pass the policy if the people who are in charge really like the winner take all? How do you move them into this new system?
That's a conundrum because sometimes in the change process, you need those who have the power, who are elected by that system, be willing to change the rules on themselves, which could mean the end of their political career. And who wants that?
Right.
Fortunately, in the city of Portland, as long as that Charter Review Commission had 2/3 supermajority of votes to recommend something, it went directly to the ballot. So it didn't go back to the city council. So that in and of itself was a really important aspect of how the change process happened. I think that overall, it's obviously much more likely to happen in places where advocates or champions have direct ballot access. You can gather signatures and put something onto the ballot. But I would also say that, we need to rethink how we have deep, open deliberations about what systems are ripe for us. We go through this decennial cycle of census and redistricting without even questioning, why are we doing redistricting this way? We just kind of here are the rules, here's the data, have at it. And we just kind of mindlessly, okay, we have to do the best we can because thems are the rules. Well, instead of just mindlessly having the redistricting process every 10 years, why don't we actually have a kick the tires, let's just potentially scrap this whole system that maybe hasn't worked for us for 10 years and try something new. And then if we need to draw districts, then we can have that as part of the process. Because democracy is for the living. It's not meant to be designed 250 years ago by people who had a very different set of values. Sure, we talk about, some universal values, but, half of those folks were still slave owners and elite. So it's hard to equate those values to be consistent with who we are today.
Absolutely. And a lot of those early decisions they made were set up to really maintain their power, right? It was started very early on.
1,000%.
Exactly. So for our listeners interested in this conversation, want to get involved, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I would check out our website, equitabledemocracy.org. We have a ton of resources for folks exactly like you, and I'm looking right at you, because we learned that it's one thing to give our partners resources and do data analysis and give them talking points about how to break the ice to have these conversations. It's another thing altogether to affect culture change, because what we're talking about is not just a policy that is kind of abstract and is good, but it actually changes potentially how we relate to one another, how we think about governing together, how we live together differently. Do we vilify each other? Are you my enemy if you're not with me? Or are we all trying to compromise to find something that we all can live with? And so what we have done is we have produced a ton of culture change products. We have this award-winning podcast called The Future of Our Former Democracy. We titled it before the 2024 elections because we thought it was cheeky, and then it became, much more prescient. So we have 7 episodes that go into great detail about Ireland and Northern Ireland and what were the kind of social and historical conditions that drove them to move to proportional representation and power sharing in a very storytelling perspective. It's not just a Between Two Ferns type show. Interview shows are awesome, by the way. We wanted to tell stories because, a lot of these stories people have never heard of before. And to ask people to think about something so radically different just required a different approach than just telling folks the data says it's good, you should just accept it. No one buys that. We are also producing a bunch of different standalone documentaries. We have one called American Troubles. It's kind of an analog to our podcast that delves deep into the parallels between Portland and the United States with Northern Ireland. So it's visually very arresting in terms of you can see how the winner-take-all system in Northern Ireland resulted in 30 years of low-level political violence that we know as the Troubles that was largely resolved by power sharing and proportional representation. So being able to tell that arc of that story over 40 minutes has been really helpful. And also very excited about, we're doing a travel show. So now I, like Rick Steves, move over Rick Steves, it's George Cheung, where we go to different countries, observe their elections, and in about 40 minutes kind of break down their social history and talk about how their system works, understand the context and the values that those communities brought into their electoral system. I eat some food, and in the former East Berlin, I drive a little Trabant car. Yeah, the stick shift is on like the shaft of the steering wheel. I'm like, they turned to me, the producers turned to me as that car was pulling up because they had forgotten to ask. They said, "George, do you drive stick shift?" I was like, oh, I thought I should say no at that point and have them freak out, but I'm a nice person, so I said, yes, I can do that. So it's really fun. It's called Democracy World Tour. Our first episode on Germany is available on our YouTube channel, so check us out.
That sounds great. Well, we will put all this information in the show notes. It is always such a pleasure to sit down with you, George. Hopefully I'll get to see you in person next time I'm out your way in Seattle. So thank you so much for spending time with us, and thanks for sharing all the amazing work that you're doing there.
Yay, come back. We miss you.
Thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our recording engineer, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts and consider supporting us with a donation. If you'd like to do that or want to learn more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Bluesky, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.